Our next writer is Deb Broad. She's the award-winning author of 8 novels and a number of short stories. Her novels include a private detective series featuring Quint McCauley, Heartstone, a contemporary Arthurian suspense novel, and most recently Getting Sassy and Getting Lucky, which are capers in the Getting Even series. She has just finished the 3rd in that series, Getting Taken. Deb has a fondness for 3 things. The first, she tells me, is corvids, which I had to Google. It's apparently a type of bird. Gross. Famous grouse, which I did not have to Google because it's a type of whiskey. And Middle Earth. Not necessarily in that order either. You can check out our website at dcbroad.com or jurassiccat.wordpress.com. Come on up.
Thank you. I'm going to read a scene from a book that I've just finished. It's going through its final rewrites, its final throes, so to speak. It's a 3rd in the Getting Even series and featuring freelance writer Robin Guthrie and her geriatric mother Lizzie, who lives in an assisted living place called Dryden Manor. The book involves a masterpiece by Franz Marc that went missing at the end of World War II, and a subplot. In a subplot, Robin finds a pound of marijuana under the floorboards of a house she just moved into. Lizzie has become quite intrigued with this find. This scene, I think, stands on its own pretty well. It introduces 2 characters who are pivotal. Robin has plans to take her mother out to lunch, but when she gets to Dryden Manor, her mother says, "No, I want you to eat here. We have a new chef, and he's wonderful." And you know, Robin, this is unusual because Lizzie usually describes the food as ghastly dreck. So here's the scene. Upon arriving in the dining room, my mother headed toward her table in the corner with a view of the gardens. But once she saw who had already claimed that table, she stopped. Only one seat at the foretop was occupied, but that occupant happened to be Ivy, the woman who had edged my mother out in the sexiest senior competition. As my mother stood frozen, cane poised inches above the ground, Ivy waved to her as though she'd spotted a long-lost friend. "Please join me, Lisbeth." My mother released her breath in a hiss. Then she straightened her shoulders as best she could and walked up to the table. Placing both hands on the crook of her cane, she lifted her chin and said, "I believe this is where I sit, Ivy." "Well, I know," Ivy smiled as she waved her hand toward the window, "and I can see why. It's such a lovely view." She focused on me. "You must be Lisbeth's daughter." She had a slight drawl, more likely Southern Illinois than Georgia, that upped her charm quotient a bit. "Please join me." I wasn't going to snub someone being nice to my mother, so before she could retreat, I pulled out a chair. "Sit, Mom." She cast me a frosty look, but settled into the proffered chair across from Ivy. I took her cane and set it against the wall, then sat in the chair between them. I was searching for a conversation starter when Ivy said, "Do you live nearby, Robin?" "I do. I've got a house in Fowler." "That's right. Lisbeth mentioned it." "Lizzie," my mother snapped. "It's Lizzie, not Lisbeth." She pronounced the latter name as though she were spitting it out. "Oh, I'm sorry." Ivy pressed her slender fingers to her mouth. "Of course, Lizzie. I had a cousin we called Lisbeth. She was..." "What's for lunch?" my mother asked. Determined to keep the meal civil, if not jovial, I pointed to the menu in front of her and asked Ivy if she had family in the area. "I do. My daughter and her family live near here, although my daughter travels a great deal and she can't visit often." She beamed at me, then folded her hands and cocked her chin as she said to my mother, "Aren't you just thrilled with Sebastian? I so look forward to his meals." My mother, determined not to be agreeable, said, "So far he's proven adequate." Ivy turned to me. "It must be very difficult to cook for so many people with so many tastes. And you know, I think that sometimes chefs seem to think we older folks have just lost our taste buds or something. But Sebastian understands that we still enjoy a fine meal." The waitress stopped by our table then, and we all wound up ordering the same thing. My mother probably would have gone with something different just to be contrary, but she ordered first. After that, she grew quite sullen, gazing out the window, and as Ivy and I talked about Dryden, the weather, and tunics worn with leggings on women over 70. Ivy believed if one leg were still slender enough, it was an acceptable look, and the tunic did wonders for masking a bit of midriff. She told me she'd done some modeling. At this point, I could see my mother's jaw tightening, but was so dismissive about it that it didn't seem like boasting. And she did look quite nice in the turquoise tunic over black leggings. Ivy kept trying to include my mother in the conversation, but this would have required my mother to unclench her jaw, which she apparently was not willing to do. I was grateful when the food arrived. Certainly this is a topic we could all talk about. We started with the tomato basil soup, which tasted very much like both tomatoes and basil. The entree was a ginger chicken stir-fry seasoned with onions and crisp broccoli. This is amazing, I blotted my mouth with a white linen napkin. It's certainly passable, my mother said. More than passable, I should say. Ivy glanced in the direction of the kitchen. A little smile played on her lips. Sebastian usually comes out after the end, my mother said, leaning toward me. Ivy likes to chat him up. Ivy giggled. I'm nothing compared to that horrible Effie. My mother looked up at Ivy. Oh, I'm sorry, Ivy said, hand to her mouth. I say things without thinking. Without missing a beat, my mother said, no need to apologize, truly. She slipped her fork under a slice of chicken. I once saw Effie flirting with Mr. Richard. Mr. Richard was the hairdresser who came 2 mornings a week to perm, trim, and cut his way through the female residence. Really? Why, even that woman who usually doesn't recognize her own son, Betty, knows Mr. Richard is homosexual. My mother gave her a knowing nod, and they were off, bound by their mutual antipathy toward Effie. And I had the chance to enjoy my meal and listen. After shredding Effie, they moved on to Mr. Richard, who had put a rinse on Ivy's hair that she thought had made her look a little sallow. My mother disagreed. It suits your coloring. When we were through eating and were sipping coffee, Ivy's hand settled on her wrist, and she grasped the face of the small gold watch she wore, reared her head back a few inches to get it in focus, then said, my goodness, it's time for my medication. She reached for the turquoise clutch she'd placed on the empty chair and rummaged through it, withdrawing a pink plastic pill box. My mother and I exchanged a look. At Dryden, pills were distributed at the nurse's station. The line formed about 15 minutes before dispensing time, and you had better not try to cut. No one was allowed even an aspirin in her room. I was waiting for my mother to tell Ivy that she couldn't take an unauthorized pill, but my mother just watched, her expression difficult to read. Maybe she was waiting for Ivy to pop the pill into her mouth so she could bust her before she swallowed it. We both watched as Ivy removed a little green oval that looked an awful lot like a Tic Tac, popped it into her mouth, and washed it down with 3 swallows of water. After patting her lips with a napkin, she smiled and said, I have a touch of micropsia, which is a very rare condition that causes things that are close to me to appear tiny. It's brought on by my migraines, which I do suffer from on occasion. She glanced around the room, then leaned toward me, and with her voice barely above a whisper said, my granddaughter makes these. Sort of a secret sauce recipe. I don't know what's in them, but I haven't had a migraine since I started taking them. And my micropsia only flared up once. She laughed and patted my arm, then leaned back in her chair with a sigh. My mother glanced over her shoulder before saying to Ivy, does your granddaughter have anything that will help you sleep? Ivy nodded in a way that implied she understood exactly what my mother was asking her. Do you have a pill that will help me sleep, and can you sneak me one? I'm afraid I don't. That would be a blessing indeed. Do you know what is good for insomnia, my mother said? What? Marijuana. I gave my mother a hard nudge in the ankle with the toe of my shoe. She started slightly, but Ivy didn't seem to notice. Her eyes had widened as though stunned. Why, that's illegal. Then she added, and it's wrong, as though that were the last word on the subject. Before my mother could point out that it was medically legal, and to my profound relief, the man of the hour made his appearance. I could tell he was a chef by the white hat, and I am not kidding, the tall white toque he wore at a jaunty angle. He made his way across the room, stopping at every table. Will you look at Effie? Ivy said, leaning across the table. My mother snorted. She's all but drooling. I should say, she's such a stump. My mother uttered the words as though bestowing a curse on Effie. I half expected to see the gnarly little woman turn into one. 3 of us watched squat little Effie attempt to charm the chef. As he prepared to move on, Sebastian smiled and nodded as he backed away from the table, with Effie leaning out of her chair like a cat smelling tuna in the next room. It wasn't long before Dryden's chef graced our table. And how are you ladies this afternoon, he asked. With a name like Sebastian, I expected him to have an accent, so I was a little disappointed that he sounded quite Midwestern, but he did have dimples that accentuated the wide smile that seemed to take up half his face. He was probably in his late 40s, early 50s, and trim with salt and pepper hair. He might have been balding, but that was impossible to tell what with the hat. Ivy took his hand. The chicken is divine. Sebastian deftly lifted her hand and kissed the back of it, then released it. I can almost hear my mother's eyes roll. And who is this? He asked, looking me straight on. I'm Robin. I touched my mother's shoulders. Lizzie's my mother. There's no secret where you get your good looks. I chose to ignore that. He might be able to schmooze these women, but Robin Guthrie wasn't falling for it. Food is really good, I said. He smiled at me as my mother asked, "What's for dinner, Sebastian?" making sure I didn't get another line in. Sebastian wagged his finger. "Ah, that's a surprise." "Oh, Sebastian," Ivy pouted and clasped her hands under her chin. "You can tell us." Sebastian made a show of looking around, then gripping the edge of the table, he leaned forward, lowered his voice, and said, "I'll tell you this, you are both going to be very pleased." "Swedish meatballs?" my mother asked at the same time. Ivy popped in with lasagna. He just gave him a wink and raised his finger to his lips. "Not a word," he whispered before he moved on to the next table. The guy was smooth. I figured the odds of lasagna and Swedish meatballs being served were slim, but the odds against either my mother or Ivy remembering were pretty good. We finished our coffee then, and both Ivy and my mother agreed to meet for dinner. I was afraid to be hopeful. When I walked my mother back to her room, I said that Ivy seemed like a nice person. After a few moments, she said, "Ivy needs friends, Robin." And after that contest, well, Ivy has to know that the fix was in. I nodded. "Keep your friends close, but your friends closer." Startled, she looked up at me. "She's not an enemy." "Well, I know. That wasn't exactly what I meant. It's just that she's a charming woman. Perky, maybe, but rather pleasant." "Your point?" "I don't know. Maybe you could learn to be a few things about being a little more, magnanimous?" She snorted. "That has nothing to do with it. Ivy is a bit, well, you saw her with those candy pills." She twirled her forefinger beside her ear a few times and gave me a knowing look. "She's developing a reputation for being a bit odd. In comparison, I seem almost lucid."